Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Choi. I'm the Executive Director of Women Cross DMZ. Women Cross DMZ is a women's-led movement for Korea peace. We are a US-based organization calling for a formal end to the Korean War and a replacement of the armistice with a peace agreement. We engage in education, organizing, advocacy, and narrative change on the issue. And we are actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary this year. So if you haven't already watched Crossings about the founding of our organization, encourage you to do so. And you can reach out to us about hosting a screening for the 10-year anniversary. Our campaign, Korea Peace Now, was founded in 2019 to educate, organize, and advocate for an end to the Korean War and establish lasting peace in Korea. Our US-based grassroots network has now grown to have hundreds of members across the country. We are multi-generational Korean Americans, humanitarian workers, faith leaders, and activists all working together to end the now 70-plus-year-old Korean War. We have committees on advocacy, education, organizing, and membership. We are a diverse group, but we're held together by principles of envisioning a world where everyone can flourish in peace, hope, dignity, and collective well-being. And we mobilize collective action grounded in intersectional feminism to end the Korean War, democratize US foreign policy, and contribute to lasting peace in the Asia Pacific and globally. If you would like to join our grassroots network, please sign up on our website, koreapeacenow.org. This year, Korea Peace Now decided to launch the series Intergenerational Healing and Learning. Although often referred to as the Forgotten War, the Korean War inaugurated the US military-industrial complex, quadrupled spending, and was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. The conflict continues more than 70 years after a fragile ceasefire was signed, keeping families separated and driving the extreme militarization of the Korean Peninsula and across the Asia Pacific. Ongoing war and militarism impacts survivors, veterans, descendants, and all sectors of society. So Korea Peace Now, in keeping this in mind, launched an online public educational series featuring activists, artists, and scholars to understand the intergenerational trauma stemming from war and militarism. So in that vein, we are so excited to introduce our speakers today. We have Professor Eric Yamamoto, who is the Fred T. Korematsu Professor of Law and Social Justice at the William S. Richardson School of Law, University.
Emeritus.
Emeritus. He is widely recognized for his legal work and scholarship on civil procedure, as well as national security and civil liberties, civil and human rights, social justice, with an emphasis on reconciliation initiatives and reparations for historic injustice. His prolific scholarship includes this text, Healing the Persisting Wounds of Historic Injustice, United States, South Korea, and the Jeju 4.3 tragedy, as well as the Jeju 4.3 tragedy, Next Step Towards Reconciliation, translated to Korean, co-authored with our other esteemed guest speaker, as well as Sarah Lee. So our other esteemed speaker, Miyoko Petit-Toledo, is the Assistant Professor of Law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, and her scholarship has appeared in the Denver Law Review, the Berkeley Journal for Gender, Law, and Justice, Asia Pacific Law and Policy Journal, as well as many other publications in South Korea. She is also the co-author of the Jeju 4.3 tragedy, Next Steps Towards Reconciliation, which I just mentioned, along with, of course, Professor Yamamoto and Sarah Lee. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Eric and Miyoko.
Well, aloha, Kathy. Aloha to you as personally as director of the Women Crossing DMZ and Korea Peace Now initiative, and to Christine An. Miyoko Petit-Toledo and I greatly appreciate your invitation to talk with you and your constituents. We've been working on Jeju 4.3 justice issues for over a decade in Jeju, Seoul, Hawaii, Washington, D.C., and through our writing, scholarship, and advocacy. And
here's a picture of us with leaders of the 4.3 Survivors Association taken in Jeju, along with retired Professor Ko Cheng-hoon of Jeju National University. He's a leading advocate for Jeju Sasam or 4.3 justice and our sponsor. So let's start with a snapshot, more details to come. The Jeju April 3rd tragedy, and I'll just note that it's April 2 now in the United States, but April 3rd in Korea right now. The Jeju April 3rd tragedy is a little-known peacetime story about widespread violence against thousands of ordinary villagers on a small South Korea island between 1948 and 1950. Orchestrated and then overseen as a suppression operation by the United States military government after World War II, mischaracterizing Jeju as an island of Reds, carried out by South Korean security forces. It is also a story about an ongoing 20-year reconciliation initiative with mounting calls from Jeju communities, Korean and American scholars, and international human rights groups for United States engagement in the social healing process. Professor Yamamoto's involvement in Jeju 4.3 justice started 15 years ago when he was invited by Professor Ko and Jeju people to come to Jeju, learn of the little-known tragedy, and share his expertise on matters of social healing for historical injustice. I joined him on his second immersive visit to South Korea over a decade ago, and our joint work and scholarship and that of Professor Yamamoto's other scholar advocates are embodied in his recent book.
So here's the cover of the book, and Kathy showed you the actual book itself. I co-designed that book cover, and the picture was one that really grabbed me. It's a picture of a recent picture of a woman survivor of the 4.3 tragedy, a child then, and now seeing, you can see it on her face, the names of her killed family members for the first time in 70 years memorialized together on black marble. After being falsely told for decades that they and other villagers were responsible for their own suffering because they were communist insurgents, falsely told that. Now inside this wonderful Stark Memorial Hall on Jeju Island, her eyes, maybe her spirits, uplifted. All this a part of the ongoing 4.3 social healing initiative marked by progress, regression, rejuvenation. The Jeju 4.3 tragedy and really this woman are the context for our presentation today. So to make this real, let's hear the voice and see the face of a survivor of the tragedy.
그래가지고 우리 아버지를 이제 제일 먼저 총으로 쐈다. 눈앞에서 우리 앞에서. 이제 총으로 쏘니까 우리 할아버지가 뭐 그걸 그러니까 우리 아들도 죽였는지 나도 죽여달라고. 아들 없는데 난 사람 뭐냐. 그러니까 이제 또 우리 할아버지도 지금 총으로 쏴버리고 또 이제 우리 할머니가 있다가 이런 요새 난 나름 할머니인데 나도 아들도 없고 할아버지도 죽어본데 난 사람 뭐냐. 그러니까 우리 할머니까지 이제 총으로 쏴배가지고 그날 저녁에 감매적을 했습니다. 할머니 아버지를.
You know, I think I speak for Professor Pettit Toledo that our interactions in meeting the survivors and their families and their supporters was so deeply moving. And we really began to realize in such a tangible way how the people still palpably suffer the trauma because the wounds haven't been fully healed. And that's why we do this kind of work that we're doing.
I've seen this video many times and it still makes me quite emotional and choked up. But to set the stage for what more is to come in our talk today, I think it's important to start with some of the history. In 1948 to 1949, Jeju Island experienced the mass killing of some 30,000 of its 200,000 residents, both in their seaside villages and in mountain caves where they fled when armed forces were ordered to kill all people found within 5 kilometers of shore, thousands detained and tortured. widespread rape of women and girls. Keep this in mind for later. The destruction of 40,000 homes and the burning of numerous villages. This devastation lies at the heart of a leading South Korea reconciliation initiatives. Survivors now who were children then. Known as the Jeju 4.3 incident or tragedy, 4.3 because it started on April 3rd, 1948. The mass killing and destruction by South Korean military, paramilitary, and police under United States military direction initially, and then later with United States oversight. After World War II in 1948, the United States, through its military, controlled South Korea.
And by the way, we chose today for this webinar because in Korea it is April 3rd. So it is, I believe, the anniversary of the April 3rd, beginning of April 3rd devastation. So the Jeju residents had protested abusive police, government extortion, starvation, rights policies. This was after World War II. The U.S. was supposedly that nation's trustee in charge of South Korea, but they really treated it more like a fiefdom. And so villagers on Jeju, which is a South Korean island, but separate from the main island, were really treated like outcast children. And so they protested. And police fired on a crowd, killing 6, and tortured men to death, many teenage boys. 200 villagers got organized in the mountains and responded, attacking a police station and some government officials. The U.S. military government then deployed to Jeju a U.S. general to command what's termed a scorched earth operation with U.S. Navy ships, weapons, and trainers. And scorched earth meaning destroy everything and everyone. The U.S. military initiated and then later oversaw much of the devastation. As Miyoko indicated, 30,000 villagers out of 200,000 massacred. Tens of thousands more wounded and tortured, many women subjected to sexual violence. Nearly all the homes were burned down. You saw a picture of a village being burned down. Economy destroyed was a village economy, fishing villages. And here's an iconic 4.3 image of a woman survivor whose jaw was shot off. And she became one to later stand up for Jeju 4.3 justice. I got to be a visitor and guest in her home just shortly after she passed away. It was a tiny home in a lava rock wall enclosed village, no bathroom, very nice and neat as part of the island village, and all of the villages were like that. All of them were burned down. Some of them were rebuilt. To justify this widespread violence against ordinary villagers, the tragedy was falsely labeled as a government putting down a communist insurgency. Jeju was called the Red Island. And the tragedy was made a taboo subject by the South Korean national government and local police through the 1980s. So people tried to speak of it, to write of it, even as a novel, with an imprisoned and tortured. It wasn't until the 1980s democracy movement surfaced against repressive military dictators that the 2000 South Korean National Assembly legislated for Jeju 4.3 truth-finding and reconciliation, a special law, with emphasis on the suffering of victims and their families. The resulting Korean language report in 2003 ascertained historical facts, examined responsibility, semi-pointed the finger at the U.S. with all kinds of facts and figures, but then let the U.S. off in the final conclusion of the report. And it made recommendations. And I served as an editor of the final stages of the 2013 English translation of the report that you see here on the screen.
Immediately after the 2003 Korean language version of the report, President Roh Moo-hyun visited Jeju and apologized to survivors and their families. The national government also took active steps towards social healing. You can see here the beautiful museum and memorial as well as the Peace Park and gravesite. But reconciliation efforts stalled in 2007 after the election of a conservative president during an economic recession. To quote Japanese reparations scholar Kunihiko Yoshida of Hokkaido National University, even though the beautiful Peace Park, the inspiring memorial, as well as the informative April 3rd Museum have been established, the problems still exist. Jeju people are still hurting. Redress is very limited. Victims still can't get any reparations because of their wrongful status as the core group of communist guerrillas, how miserably they were slaughtered. And the United States' secondary responsibility has not been discussed legally at depth yet, despite the fact that the US also played an important role. Once Professor Eric and I were in Jeju, we also interacted with teachers, community advocates, lawyers, journalists, scholars, and government officials. We presented a requested proposal for future United States involvement in the 4.3 Reconciliation Initiative, which for years the United States had refused to participate and still refuses. So this is the image with the Survivors Association. A leading, and this is part of our presentation at Jeju National University. A leading South Korea national television network heard about our joint work and efforts to engage United States officials. The NBC broadcasting system filmed an hour-long national evening news special. As a student back then, I could see the exceedingly strong interest in our collaborative work, both in Jeju as well as nationally, all of which became the focus of our subsequent scholarship and advocacy work. Professor Yamamoto's scholar advocate team went back to Seoul and Jeju in 2018 and became a part of something really significant. They interacted with large audiences about the 2018 petitions by 18 4.3 survivors asking the Jeju court to throw out the wrongful mass military commission convictions of Jeju residents 70 years earlier in 1948. These survivors sought in 2018 to finally remove the stain on their family names as supposed 4.3 criminals. Eric spoke in Seoul and Jeju about these Jeju survivors' 2018 retrials petitions. He also spoke about the relevance of the 1980s Japanese American coram nobis cases in US courts. And this too, again, became a feature story on the national nightly news. Here's more details of that extraordinary Jeju retrial story that Eric is going to tell you about now.
So, as the 70th anniversary of the 1948 Jeju tragedy neared, with much national publicity, 18 of the 2,500 Jeju residents who had been summarily taken down from the mountains where they're hiding out and summarily convicted en masse by Kangaroo Military Court for disloyalty and harshly imprisoned for years. On the 70th anniversary, 18 of them petitioned to finally remove the dark stain of the convictions from their families' names. As one petitioner described it, we were ordinary villagers who had fled to the mountains because the police were killing entire villages. As Professor Miyoko indicated, there was a police order. Any villager found within 5 kilometers of the shore was just to be automatically killed. Scorched. Continuing on with this petitioner statement, we were captured by soldiers, kept 100 per cell, per jail cell. No food or medicine, many tortured. Women were sexually assaulted. We were not involved in any rebellion. We were herded into the courtroom. Someone said, "You're guilty." We didn't know what. Some were taken out and quickly executed. Others sent to prison for 1 to 15 years. Our families' lives were ruined for generations through guilt by association, and we are still suffering. So after they filed the petitions in the Jeju court in 2018 to erase their convictions, a problem arose. Korean criminal court procedures and past judicial court cases did not directly address the Jeju court's authority to reopen decades-old convictions that were part of a present-day reconciliation effort. So Jeju Judge Chang asked Professor Ko Chang-hoon to help identify international precedents for reopening mass incarceration convictions that are now part of a larger reconciliation justice initiative. So with my permission, Professor Ko then translated, or had translated, and submitted to the Jeju court 2 chapters from my book, Law and the Japanese American Incarceration, U.S. government's World War II forced removal and mass racial imprisonment of 120,000 innocent Americans of Japanese ancestry, desolate desert U.S. concentration camps. And you can see in the picture on the book cover, that was where the concentration camps were located. So 2 chapters Professor Ko had translated in 2018 detailed the 1983 coram nobis petitions filed in U.S. courts by American citizens Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui. Their petitions sought to reopen and then overturn their World War II convictions for resisting the mass racial incarceration. In 1944, they had the courage to challenge the U.S. government in court. Lost. They were convicted as criminals for their resistance. In 1944, on appeal, the Supreme Court affirmed their conviction, ruling for the U.S. government against Mr. Korematsu and the others. Here's what those Supreme Court justices looked like when they decided Korematsu versus United States just before the end of World War II, validating the continuing imprisonment without charges of trial of over 100,000 Japanese Americans who were innocent, who had lost their homes, jobs, belongings, even families, as well as their freedom. But 40 years later, 1984, the U.S. courts hearing the coram nobis petitions filed by Mr. Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui agreed with those petitions that their convictions and the entire racial removal had been based on deliberately falsified government claims of military necessity. There had been no national security justification for the mass racial incarceration. And the government knew this and had lied about it, and the documents from that time showed it. And those are the documents presented in the petitions of these 3 men. It also showed that the government, when it was prosecuting these 3 men, and particularly Mr. Korematsu, had fabricated evidence that Japanese Americans posed threats to national security, but the court had accepted those lies as truth. Well, fast forward to the 1983-84, the U.S. courts reopened these 3 men's petitions and granted their coram nobis petitions. And you can see them here, Mr. Korematsu, Mr. Yasui, and Mr. Hirabayashi. As a young man, I was served as a lawyer for Korematsu on his coram nobis legal team. Now, those 1980s coram nobis rulings cleared the names of all Japanese Americans who had been wrongly incarcerated 40 years earlier for political reasons. You can begin to see and sense the relevance of the coram nobis cases to the 4.3 survivors' 2018 petitions in the Jeju court to erase their convictions and clear their families' names. Well, these coram nobis rulings, 1983 to 1986, laid the judicial cornerstone for the U.S. Congress's passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And here's a picture of President Reagan signing that monumental legislation. And there's Danny Inouye on the far left. The legislation authorized a presidential apology, $20,000 in individual reparations, and a public education fund for projects so that all of this would not happen again.
Fast forward to 2018. As we've mentioned, supporters of the 18 Jeju court petitioners offered the translated book chapters from Professor Eric's book on the 1980s U.S. coram nobis case reopenings. These were offered to Jeju Judge Chang as international precedent. Judge Chang then decided to hear preliminary testimonies from the Jeju 4.3 survivors, many of them seen in this picture. He was deeply moved to hear their stories firsthand. Remarkably, in September 2018, in a nationally publicized ruling, Judge Chang invalidated their original convictions from 70 years earlier. He declared retrials now were necessary to ascertain whether the military tribunals then were a sham that abusively convicted over 2,500 innocent Jeju villagers for political reasons as part of the Jeju 4.3 tragedy. Professor Eric's scholar advocates team happened to be in Seoul and Jeju at exactly this time to speak about the 4.3 petitioners' possible retrials and the relevance of the Japanese American coram nobis cases and the importance of a nation's court system now correcting egregious wrongs committed by the government against its own people. The retrials quickly commenced with the Korean nation watching. At the end of the Jeju court's retrial, in a dramatic moment, the government prosecutor himself declared that the survivors' military court convictions 70 years earlier were a fraud, an integral part of the Jeju 4.3 injustice that resulted in the deaths of 30,000 ordinary villagers and tens of thousands of traumatic injuries. The government prosecutor asked the court to dismiss the charges and clear the survivors' names. He hoped that this ruling would help heal the persisting wounds by, his words, quote, recognizing and sharing in some small way in the bitter suffering of these people and in the suffering of history and of the Korean nation, and to bring the truth of what happened then to light now, end quote. Here was the national government prosecutor 7 decades after the fact, seeking to repair some of the immense damage to these survivors and their families. It's just simply extraordinary.
And in a powerful order opinion, in 2019, Jeju Judge Chang then formally dismissed all the indictments and cleared away all the convictions. A landmark criminal procedure and human rights ruling by the South Korean courts. And here's a photo of the jubilant petitioners, survivors, and their supporters right after the court victory in 2019. And in one survivor's words, the red mark of April 3rd has been erased from our names, and all the stigma having been in prison has been lifted. For decades, we and our families lived ostracized as second-class citizens, as untouchables. I endured a life in prison without the kind of trial we saw today that left me with bitterness in my heart. But now I've been acquitted. I don't know what else to say. And I can say from having worked on Fred Korematsu's coram nobis case and been in court there when the judge, federal district judge, Marilyn Hall Patel, vacated his conviction and declared that there had been no military necessity. The kind of catharsis for the people, even decades later, was so amazing and so important. It's one reason that lawyers do what lawyers do in this kind of fashion. The story continues. Another historic turn of events. The Korean military and police, those Korean institutions most directly responsible under U.S. direction and supervision, offered their first abject apology to the survivors and families on the 71st anniversary of the tragedy. Even more incredible. In August 2019, Judge Chang awarded the 18 survivors significant compensation, the first real 4.3 reparations for anyone. Then families of another 350 who had been convicted by the military commission And some of them in their 80s and 90s petitioned to have their loved ones' identical 4.3 military convictions erased, and the court did so. Yet, a yawning justice chasm remained. No reparations or economic justice for the tens of thousands of other victims and their families, many still suffering, those who had not filed lawsuits like these 18, or the 350 that followed. Political infighting continued to scuttle broad legislative reparations. Here are the photos of survivor. One on the left as a child, then carried by his sister in front of an American-made tank. And the other now as an adult, still seeking justice. That's Mr. Kim, who served as a guide and translator for us on our trips into the community in Jeju. So, survivors, supporters, scholars, politicians press on. And the importance of continuing efforts. In January 2022, after 20 years of struggle, following intensifying public education, scholarship, justice organizing, and lobbying, with Judge Cheng's retrials and reparation orders in mind, and mounting international groups, human rights groups, weighing in, finally, after 20 years of struggle, the South Korean National Assembly finally acknowledged that there could be no comprehensive and enduring 4.3 social healing without economic justice. There had been extensive financial and psychological damage across generations, continuing to this day. The significance of intergenerational healing across generations from the past into the future in Jeju and throughout the world has become a significant focus of Professor Miyoko's powerful research and scholarship. The National Assembly authorized then substantial broad-scale individual reparations for the thousands who had suffered the violence, including family descendants, and that was in 2022. Still with some limits and important gaps. For instance, there still was no tailored redress for the many Jeju women who suffered horrific sexual violence. And with the election of now impeached President Yoon, progress slowed. Nevertheless, quite extraordinary. But one key question remains, which is the focus of my work still. What would compel, entice the United States to acknowledge its partial yet pivotal role in the 4.3 tragedy and to engage in the crucial final stages of Jeju social healing through justice?
And so let's return to the wonderfully expressive face of the 4.3 survivor, seeing for the first time her killed family members' names on black marble in the 4.3 Memorial Hall. This is why Rabbi Hillel's words from 2,000 years ago still resonate in facing the persisting wounds of historic injustice. In his words, "If I am not for myself, who will be? If I am not for others, what good am I? If not now, when?" Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. And thank you, Kathy.
Thank you both so much. We've gotten some great questions in the chat and comments of just how important this history is. And thank you both for all your deep and like long-term efforts and just the empathy with which you're moving through a lot of this work, which is so heavy. And I want to start with one question from one of the attendees tonight. And he asks, forgive me if this is out of place, but this sounds more like a massacre and maybe not so much a tragedy or incident. And so am I missing something? Please help me understand.
That's a very good point. And language becomes very important. The only way that the advocates, who are the pro-democracy advocates who supported finally surfacing this 4.3 event and the suffering, the only way they could gather political votes to create a truth commission, which is built on the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission model, which is in part based on the Japanese American Congressional Truth Commission model. So it all kind of connects. But the only way they could get this passed was to call it an incident. And that's literally the big fight. So that's why it got called an incident. And it clearly was a massacre, and so people still call it a massacre. I and others use the word tragedy because that enfolds a whole range of other kinds of things, but it really was a tragedy that was caused by a massacre, by government action and the U.S. involvement. As an aside, language matters because in the act, the one word that was excised from the final version that was crucial to its passage was the word reparations. The opponent said, even if we have to apologize, if there's a study commission, we have to apologize, so be it. We have to build a memorial, so be it. But no money, because that's kind of the real sign that we're really taking this serious. And so after a big fight, the word reparations was taken out. The supporters said, reparations are crucial, like economic justice is crucial, but we'll handle that later. Well, it took 20 some odd years later. And that's part of the work that I and Professor Pettit have helped with along the way.
Miyoko, did you want to add anything to?
No, a lot of times I echo everything that Professor Eric just said, but just to note some of the broader significance that this terminology and language really matters. A lot of time in order to make some of this project in reconciliation efforts in social justice advocacy is sometimes to find some of those compromises. But yet at the same time, scholars like us, particularly American scholars in this effort, while we might use the terminology for what it's known as in those political efforts in South Korea, what we are describing and what we are presenting is truly, it's not just a massacre, it's not just a one-day thing. It started on April 3rd, but it really continued. And some of the things we've tried to surface and bring to light and emphasize as just one example is, for example, the sexual violence against Jeju women, which oftentimes in these reconciliation initiatives can be buried or be minimized because there are so many other horrific things that are going on. But for us, it's important to unveil and reveal kind of all these different facets of what actually happened so that the social healing can be comprehensive and genuine, addressing all of those different aspects for the people who are harmed.
If I can spin off on that really important point, and you can see Professor Miyoko and I, we do a lot of work together still, and very much in harmony. In terms of the word reparation, the root word is repair, but it's been really kind of co-opted by opponents to simply mean money paid by taxpayers who didn't actually commit the wrong themselves. But reparations has a much broader meaning. The root word is repair, to repair the damage of injustice. And the damage is multifaceted. It's in terms of trauma, it's certainly financial, and that's important, but it's the loss of structure, institutions, the loss of communities, a loss of selfhood, as well as a loss of freedom. So reparation in that broader sense becomes really important. And one of the key things we are finding now, that even though there's not a memorial, and it's really a fantastic one in the museum, if you haven't seen it, you should go there. It's one of the best I have seen. And it's very sober and very moving. And even now there's economic reparations, although it's still somewhat problematic. There's still trauma through generations. And thank goodness one aspect of the repair that the South Korean government, in response to the advocacy and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, has been to create a Jeju Trauma Healing Center. They're only partially funded, but that's part of Professor Miyoko's work too, is the importance of that work not only in Jeju, but across generations, which then means really the relevance to throughout the world where there's all kinds of injustices.
Thank you both. That is a lot of food for thought. And I think especially for us, Women Cross TMZ in Korea Peace Now, as I mentioned at the top, we have started a series on intergenerational learning and healing because I think many of us, especially US based, which our grassroots network is, understand that major hurdle in peace work is education, just an understanding the history of the Korean War, which, as I mentioned, is called the Forgotten War in this country. And I think one question we received in the chat was also about how widespread is the knowledge of Sasam or for April 3rd in South Korea. And I would just add to that question also in the United States, and how have the receptions been when you are sharing these histories, both here in the US and also in South Korea, and maybe even globally if you've had other global audiences?
I guess I can start with that, and I'm sure Neil will add to that. The answer is fairly startling, but actually maybe not surprising. Very few people know about what happened, even in Seoul, for example. And it's surprising the number of people who had only heard a little bit but don't really know. And then the conservative movement, even after all this had happened and all the reconciliation efforts, are trying to reinscribe the notion that it was a communist rebellion, that people got what they deserved. And so it's still a continuing battle, and the education continues. So one reason Professor Cohen, the people he has organized, brings people to really speak on that. But that's the reason that I wrote my book. I wrote it, and that's why the other reason I published it with a South Korean publisher is they agreed to have it translated into Korean. And so it is being translated right now into Korean, which lays out really the whole history, particularly of the U.S. involvement and the U.S. responsibility. But it's more than historical, it's also a legal overlay. What are notions of responsibility? And under what kind of legal notion and ethical notion might the U.S. be held responsible to account for what it did in orchestrating and then overseeing? And so part of what we have done, Ryoko and I and others and the scholar advocates that I've worked with, is to take that message to the United States. So we did take a group, we went to Washington, D.C., we presented the translated report in Congress to Mazie Hirono and her staff. And we actually had worked out a plan and a strategy that if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, to move forward with U.S. acknowledgement, recognition, and beginning acceptance of some form of duty to help repair the damage. And things were in motion again, but now it gotten derailed again with the November election. So part we realize is still, as you said, Kathy, part of it is still the importance of the educational project that to get things really told. And so again, that's, as I wrote my book, I didn't write it like a lot of historians with no footnotes and no citations. Everything is footnoted, documented, either the original sources or translated sources from the 4.3 Commission report, so that people can realize that it's history, but it's history that when you tell it in a way that steps back and looks at it, you realize that there's substantial U.S. responsibility that calls the U.S. to the reconciliation table now to do something to repair that damage.
Speaking more from the historical but also intergenerational perspective, one thing in speaking with survivors, working with Professor Eric and other scholars, is to remember that from the tragedy or incident back in the late 1940s, once the devastation had occurred, the killings, torture, violence, and burning of villages had been completed, they were forbidden from speaking about it for decades. And it wasn't until the 1980s, after this period of silencing and suppression of this history, when pro-democracy activists were starting to discover, by way of finding skeletons and bones in Durangshi Cave, where entire villages had been slaughtered, and where their remains were there, that was when folks were starting to piece together, and including Professor Ko Chang-hoon of Jeju National University, that as to the extent of what really had happened. But that silencing is not uncommon for atrocities and tragedies like this. But within the family unit, a lot of times, even though there might have been this broader effort to reveal the history, to tell the story, to document it, including through the investigation within family units, there's the han, right? The deep sense of pain and suffering. And so within families, there was silencing, where those who were just children, who are now parents or grandparents, were not telling the story of what actually had happened to them. And that's where the National Trauma, or the Jeju Trauma Healing Center, is so significant today, within the last few years when it opened, and its work, because its primary focus is not just on healing the physical, emotional, psychological wounds of the actual survivors, who are many in their 80s and 90s. One woman was quoted as describing, what she wanted, what happened to her as a 6-year-old. She wants to forget. She doesn't want to talk about it and face what had happened. And that's, happening today within the last few years. But the Trauma Healing Center is really focusing on intergenerational healing, on focusing on the trauma of the second or third generations of these survivors, but not just them, but also the community, and the trauma of the naval base, for example, that is being built partially for US military use. And so in terms of how widespread it is, a lot of our efforts, as Professor Eric said through his book in particular, is to get those stories out. And I highly recommend you pick up a copy. And in particular, in the beginning, there are some very powerful stories about generations now learning about it for the first time, including some of his former scholar advocates. In the US, when we've talked about it, it's not necessarily, as Professor Eric mentioned, surprising to some Americans, but they really don't know about this little known history. They may not even know about, Jeju and what they're all about there. And so continuing this education through webinars like this, contextualizing it with intergenerational healing, is just so important in continuing to shape and change understandings of this history, but also public consciousness about these ongoing real efforts to get social justice and to repair that harm across generations.
To pick up on that too, Kathy, if you can jump in, because I think a lot of the American audiences are really shocked. They know kind of about Korean War, but they don't know the extent of it. And they don't know the extent of America. This is the thing, that after World War II, the United Nations appointed the U.S. as trustee. It's kind of the caretaker for South Korea. And it's supposed to give the people a chance to recover and then voice what they wanted to do with their nation, North and South Korea. But really, the U.S. wanted to keep it separate. They wanted to keep military bases. That became clear. But what people don't really see is that the U.S. really abused its position as trustee. And the Jeju people became really kind of the targets, because they are the ones who are stepping up and said, we don't approve of what's going on. We want our voice. We don't want to be abused. And so it became there's a lot of echoes in current day world and in current day United States about what happens in the suppression of dissent and the lengths that sometimes government will go, and then the kind of injustice that occurs. So part of the education process is not just telling the history, but it's also telling, it is important to tell that. It's important to tell the trauma and the continuing trauma and why it's important to heal the wounds. But it's important to see the larger social political lessons about what happens when there's government repression of people and repression of the truth. And again, in Jeju, it took, 60, 50 years before the truth could even become talked about, and what that has done to the people. And so to piggyback on that response, I'd like to pull out from the chat a question by Jadia. Thank you, Jadia. Now, just the last part of your question. What role do you think art will play in both educating the public and processing this traumatic message. And also, it's really important. It was actually really important because after the initial efforts by the South Korean national government, we saw the museum and the grave site and memorial, conservative government took over during economic recession, and it went backwards. They sort of said, well, we're all done, plus it was really a communist uprising, so that's it. And it wasn't until 2010, 2011, when the grassroots organizers came together and said, we can't live with this. I think one of the reasons I was asked to participate is because of my role in the Japanese American internment, incarceration, and redress movement. They kind of wanted some insight on how the U.S. was called to account. But one of the things that became very apparent to me when I went to visit and talk with the people and work with the advocates was the importance of not only journalists, but also artists. And it was artistic renderings, it was books, it was paintings, and it had a way of pulling into the heart of people, tapping into the heart of people, that then allowed them to engage with their mind, things that didn't seem to make sense. When they saw what happened and the suffering, you saw some of the pictures and we tried to give you just a snapshot. We also tried to put some of the artwork that you saw in the photos, and then we put that in also. But it was the artwork that played a really crucial piece, and it continues to play a piece. So in the big conference that Professor Miyoko and I went to with all the people there were included public officials and scholars and lawyers and the dean of the law school, but also artists who became a very important part of that process, and to talk with them. And so art became not only an expression, artistic expression, but also political expression. And so that's, again, I think a very important piece of this, an important part of the Trauma Healing Center.
Yeah, and I'll just add, with regard to the processing, the Trauma Healing Center focuses on more holistic healing efforts, so art therapy, forest bathing, a whole variety of things. There are certain efforts on the ground. One example is Professor Ada Kim. Her father was, I think, a 12-year-old boy at the time, and he has been doing different drawings. And they've gone and traveled to Paris, France, to present those drawings to, have them as part of UNESCO, as just an important aspect of advocacy efforts as part of education, but also as part of the healing process for her father and her as well, because a lot of what she learned of her father's story was through his drawings, which is just very recent within the last 5 to 10 years. So whether it's that type of personal drawing, whether it is the documentaries, there are several documentaries on it. There's an American historical fiction writer, Lisa C., who's written a book called Island of Sea Women, which kind of focuses on Jeju, but expands to other efforts. And she spent a lot of time there, whether it's through music or a whole variety of mediums. That's been a very important part of advocacy efforts and is part of the healing process.
If I can jump in again, Miyoko always triggers more thoughts for me to build on. Miyoko and I are lawyers. We trained as lawyers. We practice as lawyers. We're litigators. But now we're law professors and scholars. And so we combine advocacy, but also very rigorous scholarship. I know, Kathy, you're a lawyer too. And one of the interesting things is law people have not been very interested in the Jeju tragedy. They see it as because it's reconciliation and social healing. So that's not law work. And many lawyers and legal scholars have a very narrow view. So my book is the first and really the only one by a legal scholar. And legal, it's really social, political, humanitarian, all of these things is multidisciplinary. But the legal part shows that there's a structure to what happened, institutional structure, and it needs to be partly an institutional response that has an institutional structural response. So reparations can't just be saying sorry, or can't just be feeling something in the heart. That's important. But there has to be institutional reconstruction. So it doesn't happen again, but it reconstructs communities. It undoes what happened in a structural way as well as a personal kind of way. And so for those of you watching who are thinking about careers of your students, law can play an important role in social healing by doing justice in a structural as well as an interpersonal sense. And so Again, so the book itself has a section in the middle, which is the theory section, which deals with reconciliation and reparations and all the attacks against it and all the problems. But also has a section which deals with responsibility. When is it that a people, a country, are responsible for the acts of the government or its leaders that really harm others? You might not have done it yourself, but you might be part of that society. You might even have benefited, at least indirectly. What is your responsibility? What's your ethical responsibility? So the work I've done actually extends. I'm working on the Black reparations in the California Task Force and its recommendations, but I've done work on the Native Hawaiian reparations and reconciliation. The Ainu in Japan, the Filipino victims of the Marcos regime, torture and disappearance. All of these things have that kind of resonance, and it's multidisciplinary with multiple pieces. So it's great that we have so many people involved and now coming to learn about Jeju, but we need to get some really trained social lawyers. So I'm glad, Kathy, you're really becoming engaged in this piece of it. You're engaged in so many other pieces. But I think I'll stop there. And thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, well, thank you both so much. We just have 2 minutes left, so I'll just ask one last question, which is really dovetailing with what you both just so brilliantly shared. Is, as Create Peace Now Grassroots Network, Women Cross DMZ, we really situate ourselves as US-based folks, and as Eric, you just so rightfully put it, the question is, what are we doing when our government is undertaking certain actions or has previously undertaken certain actions in our name? How are we benefiting? And also, as we've a lot of discussions around the war economy, how are our communities actually suffering as a result of actions taken abroad? And so we have a lot of questions, and I'm sorry, can't get to everything in the chat, but a few people have asked, what can we do? As you mentioned, Eric, socially trained lawyers taking reparations seriously. I'm thinking of the center specifically if people want to donate, and other suggestions. I think how to get the workbook we can send by email, but maybe we can hear just both from you briefly of some steps people can take from where they are and how they might be able to plug in to help with this effort. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just jump in really fast. It's a long answer, but I'll just do it really quickly. In addition to feeling in your heart and wanting to tap into that, because that's where it has to come from, there has to be a clear structural element to what you do and what we do. It has to be a cooperative, collaborative thing. And so part of that means education, because so few people know about it. But it's not just education to create knowledge. It's education to create a foundation for political action. Because ultimately, there needs to be political action. And part of that is building a legal case. Just as like we talked about the coram nobis cases, those are legal cases. The Jeju Retrials, those are cases by a few people that have tremendous larger impact. So law has to be a part of it, but art has to be structured in many kinds of ways, which is why we try to be working with Congress and people in Congress. But you have to be let fast on your feet, because if a president changes, whether Korea or United States, then the ground for pursuing further social healing efforts changes too. So you have to become very strategic in what you do. I have a lot more to say on that, but I think I'll stop right there.
And I just want to add that one thing I've learned from Professor Eric in working with the Jeju people is that it's very important to center the people that you're advocating for and working with and standing with and by and for, and listening to them. And so a lot of our proposals or recommendations are often, vetted or in conjunction with scholars or government official, the artists, the survivors, the victims' families, to make sure that whatever we're doing is not counterproductive or harmful to them, but is actually, moving forward and pushing it forward. And then it's just to be realistic as well, as to what the political, social, economic context is at any time. And that's the strategic part that Professor Eric is talking about. But I just want to end with saying thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. I'm very sorry we couldn't get to all the questions as well. But they're very provocative and thoughtful, and we just really appreciate the engagement. And the opportunity. And I'm going to pass it back, as we have been doing, to Professor Eric.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryoka, and it's always fun to be with you. And so just on that note, one of the most important things for me was in my first trip there, first two trips, and talking with the survivors. And they've talked to a lot of people, but what I always do is ask, can you tell us your story, what happened? And I realized they don't get asked to tell their story in that way. And so when they told this story, all of a sudden they changed, and the sense of why this is important to them and to their children became very apparent. And the one question that I like to ask is that, what's next? What do you need to heal in your families, in your communities? And what can we do? And the thing that came out so strongly to me, which drives what I do, is we said the US needs to be called to account. The US needs to apologize to us and tell us what they did. That's the missing piece. It's really still the big missing piece. So on that note, I think I'll stop and thank you, Kathy, and Solby and Echo and Christine.
Thank you both so much. Yes, what a incredible note to end on, as we are really focused on organizing US-based grassroots communities and being very clear-eyed about what our role is in terms of bringing healing and reconciliation to Korea and all places globally where US militarism and war making has left a lasting footprint. And I'll just highlight for folks, if you want to get a little more too, in the chat, Solvi had shared a link from a renowned artist, Dohee Lee, who actually led us through a Hanan healing ceremony in Washington, D.C., July 2023, before a national mobilization. And through that, you can see in practice and a US-based format how art brought a lot of healing and historical justice conversations to the fore. So I'll conclude on that. Thank you so much to Professors Yamamoto and Petit-Toledo. Thank you for your time, your analysis, and your hard work. And we're very grateful. And so good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye.